the Schuman Challenge, and I have to say it has been a real privilege. Since its launch in 2017, with just 6 teams participating from the greater DC area, interest in the Schuman Challenge has grown far and wide. This year, 29 teams of undergraduate students from universities in 18 states from across the US and Washington, DC competed in the first round. This almost 5-fold increase deserves our warmest congratulations for taking the time to study the issues and to become fully conversant in them. Hats off to you and to all the faculty members who provided guidance and encouragement during your preparation. I would also like to thank the 8 judges who joined us for the first round, in particular Rachel Ellerhus from CSIS and Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. We deeply value our close partnership with such eminent think tank representatives. Of course, these events don't organize themselves. My colleagues on the delegation staff worked extremely hard to organize this contest during a pandemic. First and foremost, the press and public diplomacy team, in particular Martin Cauderon, but also my 5 fellow judges. Our congratulations and gratitude also go to our Director of Debate, Paul Hayes, and our contractors, IBF and Windrose Media. You have all surpassed yourselves. This is starting to sound a bit like an awards acceptance speech, except I won't be winning anything tonight. Before announcing the finalists, a quick public service announcement. Stay tuned for Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, who will recognize several additional teams who almost made it to the final round. So now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The finalists of the 2020 edition of the Schuman Challenge are George Washington University, Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan, and UC Berkeley. Congratulations. You have a few minutes to prepare, and you will present in the order that I gave your names. First George Washington, then Ford, then UC Berkeley. The 3 judges who will make the final ranking of the 3 finalists are Karen Donfried, President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Jim Shudo, CNN National Security Correspondent, and Stavros Lambrinidis, EU Ambassador to the US. It is a privilege to have them with us today. Thank you very much. Good luck to all 3 teams, and I will now invite Paul Hayes to conduct the judge orientation.
Thank you very much, Michael.
They need to raise their hands.
Before we begin the judge orientation, we need to position the teams for the final round.
Brilliant.
If you are one of the finalist teams, please first rename yourselves to put your school initials in your name. For example, if you are the University of Michigan and your name is John Smith, you would change your name to UM John Smith so that we can easily identify you. In addition, please raise your hands using the raise your hand feature on your profile. We will now begin the judge orientation while these teams are taken to the waiting room and prepared for the final round. The orientation will proceed in 3 stages. I'll begin by talking about the topics for today's discussions. I'll then turn to the structure of the competition. And finally, I'll talk to their judges about their roles in today's event. First, the topic. The topic for this year's Schuman Challenge is as follows. How should the EU and the US respond to China's alternative models of governance? Address a specific example or case study. In addition to the topic, each team received a copy of a topic statement that further clarifies the topic question. I'd like to draw the judge's attention to 2 things in the topic statement, which is provided on page 11 of the Judge Handbook. First, the topic statement makes clear that this year's topic was inspired by the 2019 Joint Communication EU-China, a Strategic Outlook. The joint communication calls for a realistic and pragmatic response to Chinese modes of governance. Accordingly, the students have been asked to present proposals that are both realistic and pragmatic. Second, the topic in the topic statement requests that the students present a specific example or case study, but at the same time an example that constitutes, quote, a meaningful contribution to dialogue on transatlantic issues. In other words, the students are not expected to address every facet of a response or the challenge of confronting China across the board, but instead may pick a specific example. At the same time, although the students may pick a specific example, the example they select should be significant enough to be a big part of the puzzle and an important contribution to transatlantic dialogue. That is the topic for today's discussion. I'll now turn to the question of how today's dialogue will be structured. We have 3 teams of finalists. They will be presenting one after another. The first team will be brought up. They will be allowed to introduce themselves, and then they will have 10 minutes to present their policy proposal responding to the topic. After the students have completed their presentation, the floor will then be opened for judge questions. As the chair, ambassador, we will allow you to start the Q&A period. You can either ask the first question yourself, or you can turn it over to one of your colleagues and allow them to ask the first question. The Q&A period should last for 10 minutes. We would encourage each judge to ask not only an initial question, but also a follow-up question. At the end, we will see whether we have additional time for additional questions after each judge has had an opportunity to ask one question and one follow-up. After the Q&A period has concluded, we will then take a brief intermission. The judges will retire and they will deliberate to select the 2020 Schuman Challenge champion. We will then come back. We will allow the judges to make remarks and provide feedback to the competitors, as well as announcing the champions and their honorable mentions for this year's competition. Finally, I want to talk to the judges a little bit about their roles today and what is expected of them. For the presentations as a judge, all you really have to do is sit back and listen and prepare for the question and answer period, and ultimately your deliberations as to the winning students. When it comes to preparing for the question and answer period, we would encourage you to engage the students on their policy proposals. We would ask you to push the students to see if they can support the debatable propositions they put forward with evidence or case studies or data. We would ask you to think about the proposal that they made in its relationship to the topic. Have they made a case for transatlantic cooperation? Have they justified their policy proposal as an important contribution to transatlantic dialogue on these issues? Although, once again, they do not have to address the entire question. We merely ask that they present a significant proposal on the topic question. Once the Q&A period opens, as mentioned, as the chair, the ambassador will have the floor first. He will either ask the first question or he will turn it over to one of his colleagues for questions. I'd now like to give our judges a moment to ask questions to see if there's anything I should clarify before we move to our final round. Judges?
I think you were very clear, Paul, for me at least. Are we still live here or are we off?
I believe we're still live, so we are waiting for confirmation that the team is positioned for finals. Is the team ready?
I just wish to say that I will ask the first question of the first team, and then I intend to ask Karen to take the first question in the second team, and Jim the first question in the third team, if that's okay with you.
For sure.
You want us to go ahead and get started? We all set?
into the live. Are they live? George Washington University, we've now brought you into the live stream. You may begin by introducing yourselves before we begin the time on your presentation, and then I will announce the start of your presentation time.
Hello, I'm Sean
Remember
O'Neill.
to unmute your mics.
Hello, I'm Sean O'Neill. I'm a senior at George Washington studying political science and economics, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today.
Hi, my name is Haley Knowles, and I'm a junior studying international affairs at the George Washington University, and thank you all for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Yassine. I'm a freshman at George Washington University, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you very much, George Washington University. When you are ready to begin your presentation, the floor is yours.
China's rise to join the US and EU as a global power is set to be one of the most defining historical trends of the 21st century. So far, this rise has been mostly benign and brought with it massive economic benefits for Chinese citizens and the world. However, in recent years, China under Xi Jinping has been increasingly assertive in its foreign policy, leading to concerns that it may pose a threat to the democratic liberal order the US and EU have championed. With that in mind, we must ask today's question: how should the EU and the US respond to China's alternative models of governance?
As stated in the 2019 EU-China Strategic Outlook, which served as the inspiration for this year's Schuman Challenge topic, China is simultaneously a systemic rival to the democratic world order, as well as a potential strategic partner, a dynamic which plays out in every context, from military affairs to the environment to infrastructure development and more. Rather than addressing every potential response to China's alternative models of governance, however, the 2020 Schuman Challenge topics asked us to address a specific example or case study. The specific case study we will propose today is a transatlantic response to China's global infrastructure development strategy, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Our presentation will address three issues. First, the challenges posed by China's BRI. Second, our proposed solution, the Infrastructure Development Coalition, or IDC. And third, a discussion of how the IDC will strategically respond to China through both confrontation and cooperation.
To begin, the challenge posed by the BRI. The BRI allows China to exert a malign influence on the international system in three ways. First, ballooning political influence. The Brookings Institution estimates that the BRI will constitute 60% of global infrastructure investment in the next 20 years, and an even higher percentage in many recipient countries. This dominant position in global infrastructure investment risks China having powerful leverage over political decisions in countries which receive funds. For example, Hungary, a large recipient of BRI investment, has repeatedly blocked EU statements criticizing China's human rights record. Similar instances of China's newfound political influence can be found in Croatia, Portugal, and more countries around the world. So as the BRI expands, China's political influence will balloon, threatening the integrity and sovereignty of European, transatlantic, and global institutions alike, and preventing necessary responses to Chinese misconduct. This political influence is also manifesting in the creation of parallel international institutions, which are favorable to China, like the AIIB or 16+1, farther destabilizing the international system.
Secondly is Chinese military aggression. China is using the BRI to facilitate military aggression. China does this by leveraging its political influence on security issues, compromising sensitive digital infrastructure, and expanding its physical military footprint across the globe. The most extreme example of the BRI as a tool of military aggression comes through debt trapping. Instances when China lends money to poorer countries on terms they won't be able to repay. For example, when Sri Lanka was unable to repay a loan on a port it constructed with BRI funds, it was forced to give China a 99-year lease on the territory, providing China a strategic naval presence in the Indian Ocean. This expansion is a direct threat to the EU and the US, as China is able to play a heavier hand in foreign affairs in places like Africa and the Indo-Pacific, countering the rules-based system and allowing China to snowball their military capabilities, increasing the risk of conflict and great power war.
The third challenge is environmental degradation. Simply put, the infrastructure that China sponsors and creates threatens ecosystems and communities across the globe. In fact, Jane Nakano, a senior fellow at CSIS, finds that 90% of the BRI energy projects use fossil fuels. This means rising global toxin levels in air and water, increased respiratory issues, and most ominously, the potential acceleration of climate change, an existential threat to the world. Before we discuss our policy proposal, it's important to note that the coronavirus pandemic and associated economic downturn have only strengthened China and the BRI's leverage and exacerbated each of these challenges, meaning that now more than ever, the US and EU must respond.
So, we will now turn to discussing our proposed solution, the Infrastructure Development Coalition, or IDC, as described by Lieutenant Colonel William Paquette of CSIS. Currently, the US and EU response to the BRI has been disparate and uncoordinated. The US has allocated billions of dollars through the BUILD Act. The EU has created the European Development Fund and the Euro-Asia Connectivity Strategy. Germany and France have created their own funds, and regional funds like the 3Cs Initiative have also emerged. And while these funds have begun to take on substantial infrastructure portfolios, due to this fractured approach, oftentimes the BRI is the only option countries have to finance infrastructure projects. As Djiboutian politician Abu Bakr Hadi remarked, quote, "We have no choice but to rely on Chinese funding."
However, under the IDC, European and American development funds would be united under one coordinating framework totaling nearly $500 billion. Once united, the IDC would streamline and standardize the screening process for developing countries to request funds. After a project has been accepted, money would be allocated from one or more of the IDC's constituent funds, following a standard for infrastructure development and financing that does not burden the recipient state with environmentally harmful infrastructure or unsustainable debt. If any disputes do arise under the IDC, they would be handled by a multilateral dispute resolution mechanism. Yet more, a unified IDC would allow the US and EU to target investments to achieve common strategic effects, such as protecting key digital infrastructure.
While the IDC would start with the EU and the US, it would be open to other countries willing to abide by IDC standards, and our hope would be to quickly attract the participation of other friendly states, such as Japan and Australia, as well as friendly multilateral development programs like the Asian Development Bank and the 3Cs Initiative. In fact, the IDC could even potentially integrate the Belt and Road Initiative.
Finally, we will explain the strategy of the IDC. The IDC would respond to China's BRI as a rival by outcompeting the BRI in the infrastructure funding market, but at the same time as a partner by encouraging it to reform its own practices and opening a path to economic cooperation. So first, on outcompete. The IDC will be a superior infrastructure funding source because it will match the BRI's efficiencies while offering high standards, fair financing, and unparalleled multilateral dispute resolution, expertise, and networks. As Lieutenant Colonel Paquette writes, quote, "Each country will bring its own set of geopolitical, economic, and technological capabilities to the IDC, which can be consolidated to achieve a significant advantage over the BRI. For example, some member states may have long-standing relationships with potential recipient countries, such as France and parts of Africa, while other funds can take advantage of the unique technical prowess of domestic firms, such as the US or Germany, both advantages the BRI does not have. The IDC will also likely be a more politically popular option in recipient states."
Secondly is reform. Professor Hong Yu of the National University of Singapore writes, quote, "The domestic Chinese economic situation is a major consideration in the making and implementation of the BRI. Specifically, Yu writes that, quote, "Against a backdrop of an economic slowdown due to a waning need for domestic infrastructure and stagnant export markets, the BRI is playing an essential role in maintaining China's economic growth. But as the IDC outcompetes the BRI, China will lose its dominant infrastructure development position, diminishing these economic benefits significantly. Therefore, China will be forced to reform the BRI to match IDC standards in order to remain a viable infrastructure funding source, which can grow the Chinese economy, even if it means sacrificing political and military leverage."
Third is cooperation. Following Chinese reforms, the IDC can then seek to turn China into a strategic partner in infrastructure development. This is because China would have an incentive to direct some or all of its infrastructure investment through the IDC so as to take advantage of the IDC's deep multilateral networks and expertise, favorable public image, and most importantly, large market for infrastructure contracts. And if China were to join the IDC, the world would benefit not just from the significant reforms made to the BRI, but also from the creation of a unified infrastructure development mechanism, which could significantly close the global development gap between rich and poor countries.
And before we conclude, it's important to note that the IDC is not a silver bullet for dealing with China. Rather, it is one important piece of a mosaic of political, economic, technical, and military policies which must be enacted to counter the myriad challenges presented by China's alternative models of governance. As well, we believe that the IDC could seamlessly integrate with existing transatlantic frameworks, such as NATO, in order to offer a coordinated response to China on all fronts.
As the world demands infrastructure, it's imperative the US and the EU are on the forefront of constructing proper solutions. With a coordinated response, we can counter China's attempts to impose alternative models of governance on the world. Our proposal provides developing countries a better, liberal option for funding crucial projects. IDC competition would force the BRI to reform and incentivize China to pursue a path of collaboration rather than competition, meaning that freedom, democracy, and liberty can continue to prevail in our world.
Very much, George Washington University, for your presentation. We will now open the floor for questions from the judges.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George Washington. This was extremely interesting. One of the real issues that exist in terms of BRI and more broadly foreign investments is that in many instances we see that when ports, an example you used, or others open for bidding in different countries, many times European and American companies simply do not indicate an interest to participate in those bids. How will your proposal, in fact, increase the possibility of European and American companies taking an interest in bidding when today they don't, and many times Chinese companies in China are there?
Absolutely. We think that's a great question. And one of the great advantages of the IDC is that by creating this unified framework, instead of a bunch of disparate funds here, there, and everywhere, it's going to be easier for firms to approach from that perspective, because there's one standard every time you're applying for a new infrastructure contract, instead of a different one with this fund, a different one with that fund, et cetera. We also think by unifying this framework and having such a huge pool of infrastructure development under one sort of cover, it's going to be likely that firms are going to be attracted to the IDC as their place that they're going to want to invest, because so many contracts will be running through it.
Also,
if I may ask, just go ahead, please.
Awesome. So I do want to clarify that any response to China requires a multilateral approach. While we understand the US and EU have not favored multilateral solutions in the past, in order to counter China effectively, a transatlantic solution is necessary. And I think there's two reasons why the US and EU will collaborate effectively. First, the funds we discussed in our proposal and the IDC are funds already allocated for. The BUILD Act, the European Development Fund, etc., are funds that already exist and have been allocated for. The US or EU aren't necessarily investing or giving more funds in regards to the IDC. And secondly, both the EU and the US have a vested interest to counter China and counter Xi Jinping's regime. They deem Xi Jinping to be an actor that must be dealt with. Thus, the IDC is incentivizing because it's an effective multilateral solution that addresses both the EU and US's interests head on.
Thank you very much. Karen?
Well, Sean, Yassine, Haley, that was really terrific. Congratulations on a great presentation. I'm intrigued by your vision that the end of this process could be a deeper partnership with China, and that this could end up being cooperative. And I'm wondering about the road from here to there, because it seems that in the immediate term, China would see this as an attempt by the West to push China out of Europe. And China might try to instrumentalize those European countries where it has deep investments. You mentioned Hungary, there are other examples. So could this in the short term actually end up splintering Europe and making it more difficult for there to be a cohesive response to China? Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I can answer that question. I think first off, we want to first outcompete, and then we have the possibility of reforming and allowing China to join. And we think that can happen for three main reasons. The first off is we think that especially because of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has a particularly negative image on the world stage. And a lot of countries, like Sean mentioned, in Djibouti, for example, are aware of the negative aspects of Chinese infrastructure projects and the negative challenges that they bring. Additionally, we think that this provides more of a market, and China might be incentivized to join that market. Take Amazon, for example. If you're a firm who wants to sell something, a likely place to go is to sell it on Amazon because it has that marketplace. And we think it would be similar with the IDC. The IDC would have that marketplace and advantages that the BRI wouldn't have because they don't have that unified approach and that popular significance with other countries. And we think that even if China doesn't end up joining the IDC, which we recognize could be a possibility, they would be forced to reform because of those things that the IDC brings on the international stage and that popularity that it has.
Yeah, sorry, and if I could just touch on the sort of EU unity point, which I think is a valuable point for sure, considering, like you said, Hungary. I think in recent years, we've seen a bit more unity as regards China. Specifically, I know recently they've implemented an infrastructure screening process throughout the EU. So that's one step, sort of almost similar to what the IDC would be, except for at an EU level. So I do think there's a little interest in this, even despite disunity perhaps in the past.
Jim, you want to jump in?
I think you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. Just like Grandpa, I forgot to unmute myself. I'll echo Karen by congratulating Yassine, Sean, and Haley for a very cogent and persuasive presentation. I want to ask you a question about how confident you are that the internal politics of both sides of the Atlantic at this point right now, how you overcome those political divisions to get to where you want to here, because there's a dynamic now where, I mean, for instance, in my country, in our country, that even treaties, right? I mean, we're used to a domestic policy pendulum here, swing from left to right with elections, but the way international treaties have been impacted like that by that, you look at the Iran nuclear deal, for instance, one administration negotiated it, the next administration pulled out, which of course creates questions, not just for your adversaries, but for your allies. If the US, for instance, signs on to such a deal, what is their level of confidence that in 4 or 8 years' time, they're still in that deal or that agreement? So how do you propose to overcome that political dynamic that's developed here, and frankly, not confined to the US?
So I guess I could start on the European side, and then Yassine maybe will jump in on the US side. But just as a first point, I think any solution in response to China, as Yassine mentioned earlier, is going to have to be multilateral in nature. So unfortunately, this is an inherent problem, we think, with almost any real solution here. I mean, as we've been asked today to present a transatlantic solution, we think really the world does have to unite if we want to address some of these Chinese challenges. But even within that context, we think that, at least in the EU, from what I'm going to talk about then, Yassine, on the US, the IDC would likely work for a couple of reasons. For example, in the EU, they've already created a number of funds, like the European Development Fund, explicitly aimed at countering China's BRI. So there is a sort of multilateral interest in countering China, at least within Europe. But on top of that, on the European Development Fund's website, it even says, the European Development Fund isn't just interested in being standalone. It's interested in working and looking for international cooperation. So from a European perspective, I think it's pretty likely that Europe will be able to buy into this sort of plan because first, they've already allocated the funds to attack the BRI. So it's not new funding. They're not going to build necessarily a huge new program. And two, they've demonstrated, as shown by the European Development Fund's website, they have a real interest in this sort of international cooperation. But Yassine can jump in on the US.
I think two really important things to note in regards to the US. First, in regards to US credibility and its legitimacy on the world stage, I would argue that's really harmed as a result of the Trump administration's actions, such as withdrawing from the TPP, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, mainly the World Health Organization, et cetera. And that could all change on Tuesday. But secondly, even if a Trump administration persists in 2020 to 2024, I still think that the IDC is still an effective solution because, as I stated earlier, the IDC is not creating new funds. These are funds that already exist. The BUILD Act was passed under the Trump administration chiefly to respond to China's BRI. So I would argue that President Trump, Biden, or any other American politician does have an interest in countering China, and the best way to take it is through a multilateral approach, and we believe the best method of a multilateral approach is the IDC.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from our judges?
I suppose I have a quick one. You placed major emphasis on the environmental negative consequences of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Are you implying or saying openly that the new fund that you suggest be created have environmental standards that only those, and if you reach those, would you be allowed to tap into the fund with your investment? And if so, might that make any investments under that fund or any bidding by EU or American companies much more expensive in the countries in which that bidding takes place, and therefore less attractive for their governments, even excluding corruption, or any other political or military reasons?
Yeah, I think I can jump in on this one. So I guess just first to clarify on the framework, right? We're not arguing for the creation of a new fund. Rather, it's a coordinating framework for the funds that exist below it. Sort of maybe think of it like how the WTO is layered on top of free trade agreements. It sort of sets that level of standards that must be met by funds that are members of it, and then directs the funding, sort of both ways from the consumer recipient state side as well as the investing state. But as regards to the environmental stuff, the standards, we think that's obviously incredibly important, as made clear by the EU's statement, which we were to look to for this topic. It emphasized significant amounts about climate change. And I'm not sure it's going to cost more necessarily because you see things like solar, wind energy are getting down to a price point now where they're often competitive with some of these larger projects. But also I think even if they're marginally more expensive, the bids could still win, because you see in a lot of these countries where big polluting BRI projects are being built and the harmful people are being harmed by those pollutants directly in those countries, there's significant political backlash coming from that. I mean, even in a number of the examples that we referenced within our speech, that's often the case. We've seen political backlash in places like Malaysia over some of these projects. So we think even if it's marginally more expensive, it's still going to outcompete the BRI, at least on the environmental standards, because of the political benefits of choosing something that's better for the environment, beyond all the other benefits of fair financing, et cetera, that we outlined.
Thank you very much, George Washington. Oh, would you like to ask another question, please?
Is there still time, or?
That concludes our time for this Q&A. Thank you, George Washington University, for that presentation and Q&A period. We will now bring up our second team of finalists from the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Welcome, University of Michigan. I believe we're waiting on your third teammate right now. There we have it. University of Michigan, why don't you begin by introducing yourselves to our judges?
Hi, thank you so much for this opportunity. We are very excited. My name is Bryce Brannon, and I am a senior in the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan.
Hi, my name is Karuna Nandkumar, and I am also a senior in the Ford School of Public Policy at Michigan. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure it will surprise no one to hear that I am also a senior at the University of Michigan's Ford School of Public Policy.
Thank you very much, University of Michigan. When you are ready, the floor is yours.
The European Union and the United States must cooperate to respond to China's alternative models of governance. To best achieve this goal, the EU and US should provide relief for African countries through the Paris Club and World Bank. In turn, this will encourage China to unilaterally provide similarly substantial relief. Acting now is key. Many countries in Africa, as a result of COVID-19, are experiencing economic turmoil. China is a key player to relieve the economic pressure plaguing the continent, given that they are responsible for 20% of the cumulative debt on the continent. Additionally, the US and EU acting on this issue will help address both geopolitical competition and humanitarian concerns. Through what some refer to as debt trap diplomacy, we have seen China gain political support from many African countries that are recipients of their loans. Our plan is crucial if the US and EU want to maintain their influence as global powers and regain this political support from African countries, especially given the rising importance of African countries as developing economic powers. Karuna will next explain the potential impact of this policy decision by providing relevant history and context. After, I will detail why current Chinese attempts at debt relief for African countries are not sufficient. Then, Molly will provide more detail about our proposal and articulate why specifically the US and EU spearheading this debt relief is important. Finally, I will close with some concluding remarks.
Thank you so much, Bryce. So today, China is Africa's largest single state creditor. China first started building relationships with Africa after the Cold War with the goal of advancing Maoist ideology on the continent. And since then, their lending to Africa has expanded significantly, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013. Africa's debt to China is particularly significant because of the political influence that it grants to China in African countries. A College of William and Mary study found that if an African country votes with China in the United Nations General Assembly an additional 10% of the time, it will receive an 86% increase in official aid and 159% increase in grants. This increases China's ability to influence international organizations and decisions made on a global level, reducing the power of the US and EU to further our own interests. Today, as Bryce mentioned, China is responsible for approximately 20% of the continent's debt, which is more than all other African government-to-government debt combined. From 2000 to 2017, China, which includes the Chinese government, Chinese banks, and government contractors, provided $143 billion in loans to African governments and their state-owned enterprises. These loans are made up of concessional loans, credit lines, and development financing. Preferential loans from China's Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank represent the largest part of China's overseas lending and are not included in any of China's current relief, which Bryce will touch on later. So why does this matter? With the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, growth in sub-Saharan Africa is forecast to fall from 2.4% in 2019 to negative 5.1% in 2020, which would be the first recession in the region in over 25 years. Challenges that many African countries are facing right now include trade and value chain disruptions, reduced foreign financing flows combined with capital flight, direct impacts on health systems, and the potential of a massive food security crisis. The World Bank VP for Africa has called for a standstill on all official bilateral debt service payments to free up funds for strengthening healthcare systems, preserving livelihoods, and enhancing food security. In reality, on average, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, African countries already spent more on repaying debt than on healthcare. Because of the increased potential now for humanitarian disaster, if China does not provide further debt relief, or if that debt is not offset by other countries or multilateral organizations, many African countries may have to choose between repaying their loans and fulfilling the basic needs of their citizens.
Chinese action thus far has not been sufficient. China has only taken minor action in an attempt to relieve some of the economic stress on the African continent. There are two different things that China has recently said that they will do related to debt relief for African countries: the G20 Debt Suspension Initiative and $2 billion in support. In April, the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative for Poorest Countries was created. As a part of this agreement, China agreed to suspend principal repayments and interest payments until the end of 2020. And since then, it's been extended through June of 2021. However, Africa will need debt relief beyond this time, as global economic recovery is projected to take at least 2 to 3 years. President Xi also committed China to providing $2 billion in COVID-19 response and relief over the span of the next 2 years. And this relief was described as being particularly targeted at helping, quote, economic and social development in developing countries, end quote. However, this language is extremely vague. And in fact, it is likely that the two things that China has agreed to do are not mutually exclusive. And instead, all suspended payments are being counted toward China's $2 billion in support, meaning that China has committed itself to providing even less relief than it may initially appear. China is currently not considering more substantial long-term debt relief or additional support on its own, so outside pressure is necessary to elicit action.
We propose that the European Union and the United States provide substantial debt relief for African countries through a World Bank relief program and additional bilateral relief from the Paris Club countries. This will encourage China to provide similarly sufficient relief. There are many different ways to determine the amount of relief for each specific country, but for the purposes of our proposal, we think this relief should be based predominantly on the following three factors: the policies that are being adopted for the future, the humanitarian need and bankruptcy status of each country, and the countries where China's influence has been particularly targeted, such as those with extensive oil resources. The exact form of this debt relief should be determined through collaboration with different African governments. Some alternative options to total debt cancellation include postponement of loan payments, debt and equity swaps, or debt restructuring. Due to the fact that two multilateral organizations, the Paris Club and the World Bank collectively, own an estimated 26% of African debt, providing an extension of debt relief through these groups will substantially aid it in rebuilding the economy of the African continent. As 30% of China debt is owed to private creditors, the US and the EU should additionally increase financial assistance and investment to the African continent in order to offset debt burden and allow for economic recovery. Providing major debt relief through the World Bank and the Paris Group, and additional financial aid directly coordinated by the United States and the European Union will place significant pressure on China to additionally participate in multilateral debt relief efforts. This is an opportunity for the US and the EU to demonstrate true leadership on the global stage, forging closer bonds with African countries and providing the financial assistance needed for them to recover. The reasons to intercede are both humanitarian, to relieve suffering in the African continent, and pragmatic, as an impoverished, debt-controlled African continent would carry debilitating spillover effects on the rest of the world. Additionally, China presents a growing threat to US-EU security concerns. For example, the BRI initiative has the potential to create physical access problems in parts of Africa for both the US and European militaries. If China seizes strategic assets that have been used by some countries to secure loans, like it did recently in Sri Lanka, this could also diminish US and EU influence in the region. China's foreign policy strategy in the African continent relies on the reputation they have built through close economic ties. This means that if China does not participate or take further measures to grant relief to African countries in the face of this coordinated action from Africa's other creditors, they are jeopardizing their built-up influence in the region. Overall, our plan could help to address up to 46% of African countries' debt, 20% from China, 10% from the Paris Club, and 16% from the World Bank. If China fails to take action, the stronger economic connection built through the debt relief would reinforce the important ties of Western democracy to the African continent, benefiting the EU and US by countering China's growing influence in the region.
A quick and comprehensive solution is important to prevent humanitarian and geopolitical disaster. A joint US-EU action is crucial. China is currently in the driver's seat, but has demonstrated they will not act on their own. Multilateral action, placing pressure on China, is the quickest way to reach a holistic solution. Our proposal would not only result in countering China's alternative models of governance, the intended goal, but it would also help the EU and US gain influence, as well as provide significant relief for the African continent. The US and EU acting together will make them better able to counter China, as disconnected unilateral strategies would not pressure China enough. This unified approach toward China would allow the US and EU to create a stronger front and collaborate more in the future over other important issues. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our proposal today, and we would be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, University of Michigan. The floor is now open for questions from our judges.
Karen, you want to go first?
Thanks. I am delighted to ask the first question of the Power Women trio from the University of Michigan. That was great. And I think it's really compelling to think about a project that the US and the EU can cooperate on that's beyond their own borders, to look how to be a force for good in the world. And I wanted to draw you out a little bit on the idea that the debt relief program you're proposing not only has humanitarian merits, but also is pragmatic, not only in terms of encouraging China to pursue similar debt forgiveness, but you also said that it provides an opportunity for Africa to then rebuild its economies. And I'm curious if you pursued that line of thought. I mean, some people might say, oh, well, you're going to give debt relief, but if these countries don't have viable economic options, they're just going to need more debt. So how do you think about that next step for these countries on the African continent? Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So one thing right off the bat is that we think that there should potentially be some policy conditions that are packaged with this debt relief as it comes from these multilateral organizations so that they don't fall right back into debt, like you were saying. So potentially it's not like a precondition to receiving the aid, like there's nothing they need to demonstrate in advance that they have already done other than being within the 3 factors that we have laid out that are necessary to receive the debt. But instead that there are potentially some things they do on the back end to ensure that this relief is being used in appropriate ways. So like one thing could be to require regular reporting from the governments on where the aid is going and how it is being used.
Thanks, Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and really well done, Bryce, Molly, and Karuna. I enjoyed it. I guess my big picture question is, what's best for Africa, right? In this, the political pressures are understandable and real, and it's a story we've seen in many places, right? Where it's a quid pro quo. We're going to give you this aid, but we want something in return, right? Whether it's base access, you name it, or votes in the UN, that sort of thing. But of course, the need, as you cite, with the COVID crisis and economic contraction of 5% this year, which is debilitating for some of these countries. How do you convince leaders in those countries facing real crisis that the best option is not to take what's available right now from China, as opposed to something that we hope to get together for you between the US and the EU?
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. And I'll just say something briefly and then let my other teammates add on. But just to start us off, I think this is all about the approach to this aid. So I think that this aid package needs to look at each African country individually as its own individual player. For example, we aren't proposing full debt cancellation specifically because some African countries have already raised the concerns about full debt cancellation, such as Kenya, who recently said that they didn't want cancellation, in fact, because it might distort their situation. And so I think the most important thing with this aid package is that it would work very closely with the governments of each African country to ensure that the aid is implemented in a way that really benefits the governments of that country. And that would be a difference from both past US-EU policy and past Chinese aid to the continent.
And adding on to what Karuna just said, I think this question even goes back to the question that was asked before about the developing markets, because this really is a policy plan that could have the potential to encourage growth in the developing markets in the African continent. It's a plan that will help with debt cancellation, but also promote an era of economic cooperation in strengthening those economic ties. So we really see it as a plan that has a great potential for collaboration to strengthen those multilateral organizations in the entire African continent.
Well, on my part as well, thank you so much, Bryce, Molly, and Karuna. This was fantastic. My question returns to the actual topic. The topic focuses on what the EU and the US can do, not to bring economic relief in some parts of the world, not necessarily to bring economic development, but specifically to address the alternative forms of governance promoted by China. Now, I heard a very compelling proposal about giving debt relief to Africa, whether full debt relief or partial debt relief, on the part of the EU and the US as leaders in this effort with multilateral financial institutions, in the hopes that if we succeed there, China will be pressured to do the same. But if in fact China cancels the debt that it has as a majority, as you said, in Africa, why does that not getting off the hook? In many ways, it is China's process of investing today in many African countries, in some cases polluting them, in some cases having thousands of Chinese workers coming in and affecting the labor market in negative ways, that is creating a bad image for China. that is exposing some of the negatives, in fact, of its governance models that we are trying to address. Isn't your proposal potentially getting China off the hook if we succeed that the Chinese forgive their debts to the African countries?
So I think that even if China were to agree and kind of follow suit and the pressure worked and China does as we hope and helps to relieve some of this stress on the African continent, that there are two things. One, that Africa will have seen in this instance who led that debt relief. It was not China coming in on their own and doing this, but instead it's starting with these multilateral organizations like the World Bank and also other countries like coming in through who are members of the Paris Club to solve that problem, and China was not doing it on their own. So it'll show that it was kind of like the US and EU who led that, and hopefully that would still help with like some broader influence in the region. Second is that even if China agrees and kind of cancels, or not cancels debt, but helps to provide relief in this instance, hopefully going forward, it would mean that they have to abide more by the norms of providing loans that other countries are following. So China is not currently in the status quo providing loans and following kind of same governing like rules and regulations that exist that other countries are following. So if the US and EU were able to step in and kind of be successful, China would understand that they are not the only ones anymore who are kind of like a player on the African continent, and instead other countries are coming in. So China needs to start abiding by these norms that are agreed on by all other countries, not all other countries, but most other countries except for them, especially countries in Europe and the United States.
And just to add very briefly to what my teammate already outlined, I think the core reason why our proposal does combat China's alternative models of governance centers around this idea of bringing China into an international system that the EU and the US have created. So just to bring it back to that question, the goal of this is really to continue that process of attempting to have China abide by the norms that already exist today.
Let me just jump in. I'm struck by the way you framed this in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on Africa, and that's compelling. But I'm wondering about how you talk to European citizens and American citizens. I mean, in Europe right now, we're seeing this tremendous spike in COVID-19 cases, and actually the African continent, perhaps because of their history of dealing with past pandemics, the public health mechanism seems to be working pretty effectively in many of the larger African countries. So how do you convince citizens in the US and Europe that Africa needs their help more during COVID-19 than they perhaps think they need that help from their governments or from the EU? Back to you.
So I think that the most important thing to consider here is the situation that the countries in Africa, or at least the 19 countries that the IMF has already labeled as in need of debt relief, that those countries are in a very different stage of the developing process at the current moment, as opposed to the EU and the US. So as I think we previously mentioned, there hasn't been a recession in the region in the past 25 years, but this recession has the potential to push people who just recently emerged from poverty over the past 20 years back into the depths of a depth of extreme poverty that the citizens of the US have been lucky to not experience in recent years. And I think that illustrating that difference is key to convincing both EU and US citizens that the need there is greater at the current moment.
And additionally, just adding to that super quickly, is that given the economic situation that some of these countries are in, if it did escalate and there was economic turmoil, it could lead to potential future conflict and wars in the region, which could have spillover effects that directly impact US citizens. So for example, these wars could threaten or disrupt oil supplies that many countries like China and the US and other European countries might directly rely on.
That is time, unless one of our judges would like a follow-up. Thank you very much, University of Michigan. We will now welcome our third finalist from UC Berkeley. Welcome, UC Berkeley. Before we begin your presentation, you may introduce yourself to the judges.
Hi, I'm Victoria Stroys. I'm a senior in political science studying at Berkeley.
Hi, I'm Evan Gong. I'm an undergraduate at Berkeley studying political economy and German.
Hi, I'm Alex Kaplan. I'm a third-year undergrad at Berkeley studying political science, and we are representing UC Berkeley.
Thank you, UC Berkeley. When you're ready to proceed, the floor is yours.
China's state capitalist model of political economic governance has resulted in an uneven investment playing field between Chinese and Western markets, particularly in the EU and US. This is most apparent in China's asymmetric foreign direct investment approaches, which is distorting the global concentration of high-tech assets. Western multinational firms seeking to access China's market are often required to form international joint ventures with domestic Chinese partners. These relationships, most often required in high-tech manufacturing industries, are characterized by technology transfer requirements, wherein the rights of the foreign intellectual property holder are often severely curtailed. Despite modest reforms to its foreign investment law and its technology import-export regulations, China still shields domestic companies from competition through an array of illiberal protectionist barriers, including selective market opening, licensing and investment restrictions, and localization requirements.
China's goal of technological dominance is further enabled by its go-out investment strategy, which encourages its enterprises to invest billions of dollars overseas. Through this, Chinese state-owned enterprises have capitalized on the openness of Western markets by investing in strategic sectors in both the EU and US economies, particularly in emerging technologies. The EU and the US are concerned that Chinese state-backed companies are gaining too much access to key Western technologies, customer data, and sensitive infrastructure, and may share this information with the authoritarian Chinese government. This harms national security and makes companies vulnerable to espionage. The difference between China's inward versus outward foreign direct investment practices highlights the lack of reciprocal market access between China and the West.
Fueled by concern that China is becoming a strategic rival rather than a partner in the liberal global order, the EU and US have each independently taken action to introduce more robust screening procedures on inward foreign investment. The EU's framework for the screening of FDI entered into force in 2019 to defend Europe's strategic interests across industries working with critical infrastructure and technologies. Similarly, the US took measures to enhance its national security review process on FDI when the Trump administration passed the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act in 2018 to augment the oversight power of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, also known as CFIUS.
Given the aligned FDI interests between the EU and US, we propose a joint clearinghouse to facilitate the transatlantic exchange of information on national security reviews. This is not intended to choke off investment. We recognize the benefits that foreign capital has on host economies. Instead, this is meant to introduce bilateral and potentially multilateral mechanisms to check and raise concerns on investments with national security risks. We envision the clearinghouse as an attentive measure to control for China's cherry picking, rather than a tit-for-tat strategy of erecting illiberal barriers in response to China's alternative model of governance. Now we will present our case study on Huawei, the Chinese multinational telecommunications company, to show why an EU-US information clearinghouse would be useful in addressing China's outward foreign investment practices.
Huawei dominates the global telecommunications market with quality and inexpensive 5G infrastructure. However, the company has come under intense scrutiny from the US and increasingly from EU member states because of its close ties to the Chinese government. There are concerns that the Chinese government can pressure Huawei to share data from users in countries whose telecommunications networks use Huawei equipment. And Chinese companies are obliged to comply with government requests for data sharing according to Article 7 of the Chinese Intelligence Act.
Coupled with the increasingly aggressive political posture from the Chinese government, the Trump administration issued an executive order in May 2019 to ban foreign telecommunications equipment providers that are deemed a risk to national security and has imposed supply chain restriction to choke off Huawei's access to technologies that have American parts. On the other hand, the response of European Union member states toward Huawei has wavered. Seeking to deploy its much sought-after telecommunication infrastructure across Europe, Huawei invested millions of euros in the past year into research facilities and manufacturing centers to countries including the Netherlands, France, Germany, the UK, and Poland. Such investments, like its purchasing of equity stakes in the company that commercializes research at Oxford University, gives Huawei access to some of the most promising early-stage technology being developed in Europe. This case demonstrates the precarious position of EU member states as they balance national security risk with the benefit of inexpensive 5G infrastructure.
This case study of Huawei is a lesson that illustrates the need for the EU to re-examine its relationship with China, to treat it as a systematic rival and forge a path where it is not as dependent on investment from other Chinese firms for its technological needs. We believe that a closer alignment between the EU and the US through the Shared Information Clearinghouse for National Security Reviews would be a first step to coordinating how individual states ought to treat investment from China in strategic industries. The solution we will propose will provide the frameworks and institutional capacity to make foreign investments more transparent and therefore enable greater harmonization in addressing Chinese investment while retaining a flexible and pragmatic approach towards China.
Our solution builds off the existing EU framework for the screening of foreign direct investments, which officially entered into force on April 10, 2019. We advocate for the cooperation between the European Commission and CFIUS to build a shared information clearinghouse for national security screening of foreign direct investment. Chinese investments in critical technology sectors and in the telecommunications industry should receive extra scrutiny because of the national security risks. The United States would be willing to cooperate in developing this clearinghouse because there is already strong bipartisan support for the need to strengthen screening of Chinese investments. Moreover, the US companies operating in the EU would benefit from the US's cooperation in order to ensure that they are protected from China's unfair overseas investment practices. Because CFIUS has well-developed practices for screening of foreign investments in key technology sectors, it can lend its expertise to the EU and encourage member states to model screening processes after CFIUS.
While national security screenings are currently performed by individual EU member states, this should not impede the creation of a clearinghouse at the level of the EU Commission. The clearinghouse will facilitate the exchange of information by enabling all member states to inform each other of investments undergoing national security reviews in their respective country. The United States, other EU member states, or the European Commission may choose to raise concerns related to specific investments, comment on ongoing reviews, and request additional information from the government with jurisdiction over such review.
All member states are obliged to ensure that the interests of individual member states, the EU as a whole, and the US are taken into consideration before approving foreign investments. This clearinghouse is not a regulatory agency. Any enforcement measures can be taken by the European Commission, which can raise issues with its member states if a foreign deal threatens EU-wide security, or even take legal recourse to prevent the foreign investment from going through.
This clearinghouse will facilitate the transatlantic exchange of information regarding foreign direct investment inflows under review in strategically important sectors and enable countries to raise concerns related to specific investments. We recognize that this is not a cure-all solution, but it can lead to spillover effects into other areas in which the EU and US can cooperate.
Conclude. EU-US cooperation in building a shared information clearinghouse is a concrete first step that will align the European Union closer to the United States in how they approach China as a systematic rival that promotes an alternative model of governance. Our solution is a reasonable response to the gradual distortion of the global concentration of high-tech assets enabled by China's state capitalist model of governance. of which national security concerns appear to be the most immediate and alarming byproducts.
To reiterate, our solution is only a first step. It won't be enough to simply respond to China. An ideal long-term but politically ambitious solution would be a joint EU-US investment fund. This investment fund, akin to a 21st century Marshall Plan, would support Western emerging technologies and foster partnerships with other democratic nations of strategic importance in this field, such as Japan and India. This would help ensure Western companies like Nokia and Ericsson can remain competitive with Chinese companies like Huawei while upholding Western democratic values. Thank you.
Thank you, UC Berkeley. The floor is now open for questions from our judges.
Jim, you want to go first?
Please, thanks so much, Stavros, and well done, Evan, Alex, and Victoria. So central, right, this relationship to not just EU and the US, but the world right now. I wonder how you avoid sparking Chinese fears, which already exists, right? That steps like this are a direct attack on their core economic and national security interests, right? Because they view these industries as essential to their country's economic growth and survival, and therefore view increasingly, right? I mean, this dynamic has existed for some time, but particularly in this environment, as the U.S. has stepped up the trade war and the resistance to Huawei on 5G, across the Atlantic, it's become more pronounced. And I just wonder how you address that so that it doesn't bubble up into an even more of a conflict, right? At a minimum, a trade conflict, and perhaps more.
Well, thank you so much for the question. So our solution is simply a shared information clearinghouse. So it's not any sort of regulatory mechanisms. It facilitates information. It facilitates information between the different member states and in the U.S. And it promotes the trading of this, the sharing of this information. So what we see this measure to be is simply a protective measure that would help ensure transparency. It would help ensure that symmetric information is being received on all sides. Like I said, it's not an enforcement, it's not a regulatory measure. All enforcement measures need to be taken through the EU Commission. In the United States, for example, CFIUS can make recommendations to the president, and the president can choose whether to approve or not to approve of such deals. The Department of Justice can sue to prevent, to block those deals. But our solution is not any sort of regulatory or enforcement action. It's simply information clearinghouse that facilitates better information distribution.
Could I then ask a follow on that? If it is purely a clearinghouse, doesn't that information sharing already take place to a great extent, but both at the private sector level and the public sector level among intelligence agencies, exchanging information, for instance, on Huawei's, network routers, right? Whether they're backdoors, et cetera. What would be the marked step forward then if it's mostly information sharing?
So the information sharing essentially would allow for greater exchange. And so the EU currently, there's among all its member states, only a very rudimentary framework. Like I said, the framework that was put into place only came into existence in 2019, so it's very new. And essentially, it seeks to, there is intelligence that's being shared, but it seeks to centralize this information through this clearinghouse. So it's an easier place to access. There are contacts within every member country that would be appointed to ensure that information is flowing clearly.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And if I can add on, if I may, just to address your initial question, I have a question of my own with that respect. So what do you do when a country's core economic interests are associated with national security threats, right? This is the concern with China's alternative model of governance. And then for your next question, would this step on China's toes? Maybe, but would this be a problem? Not necessarily. First of all, we don't want to choke off investment. And second of all, these measures already exist. The United States already passed FIRMA. CFIUS already has these augmented oversight capabilities. And the EU already has existing frameworks for regulating and monitoring foreign investment. And actually, our solution works off of the existing guidelines of the EU's foreign investment screening regulations, which calls for pursuing policy cooperation on FDI screenings with relevant partner countries.
So, guys, thanks from my side as well. Absolutely fantastic presentation. You seem to have focused quite a bit on the foreign direct investment regimes of the US and the EU. But the European Union very recently announced a very extensive exercise, both to identify on the level of member states threats, especially associated with 5G technology, security threats, and then it issued a toolbox for its member states to mitigate those threats. This, given the fact that you chose Huawei as an example, would seem to be a more relevant framework for you to analyze what is happening today. I would be very interested in your thoughts as to how effective that European toolbox to address security threats related to 5G is.
In fact, it's actually a very good start. I think in particular within this information clearinghouse, and it facilitates greater information sharing. But the toolbox that was put into place by the EU, we think it's a great step. In fact, we think that by presenting our case study in Huawei, the reason why we did that was to show that if this information exchange had already been into play or had taken place or had already been in existence, perhaps we wouldn't be seeing such difficult, such fraught tensions with Huawei or difficulties with Huawei as we're seeing now in terms of trying to get Huawei equipment out of the European markets. And that's obviously very, very difficult, very expensive, and there's very few realistic alternatives that are cost effective. So in fact, we see our proposal as something that would help mitigate future sorts of problems in terms of Chinese investment coming into Europe.
Let me have a quick. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that to add on Evan's exactly that. Once and firm like Huawei entered the European Union, entered a single market, it's very difficult to get it out. And so even if the toolbox is a very good tool to put measures that countries can refer to, the problem is not all countries would especially abide by it. And right now, in the case of Huawei, we can see that some countries don't know exactly what they're going to do about Huawei yet. They have not really issued if they're going to try to limit the use of 5G infrastructure offered by Huawei. So that's why we think that clearinghouse would be a first good step to really have a good amount of information before allowing companies such as Huawei to enter the single market.
Right, and adding off that, I think that was a really great point. If we were to look at some of the existing current events that has happened surrounding Huawei trying to deploy its 5G infrastructure in Europe, let's look at the UK. Despite what's happening with Brexit, the United States had lobbied the Johnson government to shun Huawei's 5G infrastructure, but because there was this lack of cooperation and coordination, we saw that the UK agreed that they would get rid of Huawei's 5G infrastructure, but then Vodafone says that it won't come through until 2027. Therefore, we'll give them enough time to develop 5G infrastructure based on Huawei's resources.
Okay, quick follow-up, guys. All this sounds like you are now advocating for something more than just exchange of information. You're advocating for regulations and laws to exclude entirely Huawei or other companies that are judged by our governments as being a security threat. But your proposal has to do with information. So my question really quickly is, right now, the foreign direct investment screening exercise in Europe and the 5G toolkit, they do include fundamentally the exchange of information on these issues among European Union member states. So your proposal in a sense says, okay, this is fine, but we just want to bring the US in there as well, so the US can also have a say. And I say the US have a say because I understood you saying that that whatever is decided in the end after the information is exchanged should also take into account US interest, you said. EU interests, other interests, and also US interests. So that's quite a complicated thing to put my mind around. But in the same context, in this network that you suggest, the clearinghouse, would the United States have to take into account European Union interests when it decides to approve or not to approve any investment in the United States itself?
Well, in that case, we would say that the U.S. is already acting pretty much unilaterally in deciding how it whether it approves or does not approve of Chinese investment. Our solution, we want to make sure it's clear. It's a clearinghouse. It's not any enforcement measure. So it simply facilitates exchange of information. Relevant governments, each member state can decide how, in the end, they wish to pursue, how they choose to regulate, how they choose to regulate, to approve of national security or approve of foreign investment, whether that's in the end done or not. The U.S., we believe the U.S. already has very strong measures it's taken on Huawei, but our solution is simply a clearinghouse. It facilitates information so that all sides know of the other members' concerns, and it knows of all sides know their positions, and then they can decide accordingly.
And really quickly, just add on to that, a main function is that this clearinghouse will allow countries, based on these greater transparency frameworks, to raise concerns. Because they're able to raise concerns, then this can possibly engender a stronger retaliation.
Thank you. Karen?
I see we are out of time. Should I ask a question? Is that okay?
Please proceed if you have a question.
Well, first, I just have to say, Evan, Alex, Victoria, the fact that you mentioned the Marshall Plan, of course, immediately got you points from me. But great presentation. I wanted to ask you sort of where the logic of the argument leads you, because technology is going to be where the US, Europe, China battle out the 21st century. And you used the example of 5G. You know, if we think about AI and robotics and synthetic biology, and we think about the jump start China has on many of these areas because of the way it hoards data and doesn't respect privacy of data, certainly among its own citizens. Is this a first step in what you would say is a technological decoupling of the US and Europe from China, or where is this policy direction leading you?
Right. So this policy direction is simply an information exchange where all sides can be apprised of information and they can voice their concerns. Any enforcement measures, there already exist enforcement measures through the US. The Department of Justice can block deals. The EU can sue to prevent deals the European Commission can sue to prevent deals from going through anti-dumping and other measures that we can take. But what we see this is it brings a closer alliance between the US and the EU, closer cooperation in this specific field, in investment, and particularly in technology. And we recognize this solution that we've proposed is not going to be a cure-all solution. We see that if the US and EU are serious about trying to gain dominance in the 21st century, particularly in the technological realm, they'll need to consider an investment fund. They'll need to consider a Marshall Plan to support technologies to ensure, as China is already doing with their Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Silk Road initiatives that they've done through their state capitalist model of governance. And so the US and EU really have to consider this option. It's very difficult politically, very ambitious, but our solution is simply a first step to help to facilitate greater transatlantic sharing of information and cooperation.
Right. And also, I don't see this as a measure that can accelerate decoupling. The West inherently has concerns with balkanization, splinternet, bifurcated tech ecosystems. But I think what you're hitting at is that we need to take our approach in the context of a realist world within this tech Cold War, the realist world where the actions taken by one set to increase their national security, which is happening through China's strategic and a lack of reciprocal market access through these strategic investments, this is inherently concerning to the West. And so they should respond in kind, which isn't necessarily to say that we want to decouple. We don't see that as an intention.
Thank you, UC Berkeley. If there are no more follow-ups from our judges, that concludes time on the question and answer period. Thank you, UC Berkeley, and to our other finalists.
Thank you.
Judges, you've been provided with the details for a conference line to call in for your final deliberations. Everyone, we will take a short break while our judges deliberate and then return for our award ceremony and the recognition of our champion and the honorable mentions from the past week.
All right. This took us a little longer than expected, but that's because the presentations were so amazing. And let me just say, if there were any need of any proof of how American undergraduate education brings out some of the most brilliant, eloquent minds, this is it. We're so proud as the European Union to be able to host the Schuman Challenge now in its 4th year, and every year, I have to tell you, even more impressive. So thank you to everyone participating in this. I went to college in this country and I went to a law school in this country. So quite frankly, I've lived firsthand the benefits, and I advise everyone who goes through this process to keep an open mind in terms of what they want to do in the future. There's so many amazing things that you learn and you get exposed to. But I'll tell you one thing to our 3 teams: stick with foreign policy. You're brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, yes, look around. Maybe there are other things you can do, but this is great. And I'll tell you, last year, my first week in this country, I had the chance to host at the EU residence physically. We didn't have COVID at the time. A lunch for the winners of last year's competition. The topic then was Ukraine, and my State Department friends who also participated there at the time, and we could arrange physically a visit of those students to the State Department, told me how remarkably impressed they were as well. And I know that everyone watching this broadcast certainly shares this feeling. Thank you. And it's important because the transatlantic relationship, the EU and the US, is the biggest economic and security artery of the world. When we work closely together, we can change lives and livelihoods. And indeed, one of the biggest challenges we face is governance and human rights. We are not engaged today in the world, what I often say to people, just in trade. Every time we put a product in our containers to take around the world, we also put in that same container our values. We respect labor rights. We protect the environment. We don't destroy it. Products cost a little more if you pay your workers more and if you protect the environment. But these values are also exported in containers by other countries, not just us. And how it is that we manage to look at the intersection between economy and human rights and governance was the challenge of today's discussion. So I am just deeply grateful to all of you for having taken the time to participate. In the interest of time, I will not make comments on the presentations, but I will ask my colleagues, Karen and Jim, to give their own assessment of the 3 fantastic teams today. So, Karen, you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. And first, congratulations to all 3 teams and all 9 individuals. You really were fantastic. And I thoroughly enjoyed hearing all of the presentations. And I think what was powerful about all 3 of them is, as someone who works on transatlantic relations, the power of that partnership is not so much about what the US and Europe mean to each other, but it's the US and Europe working together to be a force for good in the world. And if we think about the challenges to that today, China is an important part of that conversation. And to have all of you thinking about how can the US and EU work together on a big challenge facing both sides of the Atlantic, I thought was really important. And on the specific topics, the GW team focusing on BRI was interesting to me because I feel that Europe's approach to China has changed more in the past 2 years than it has maybe in the past 2 decades. And I think BRI was a part of that because the US has had a relationship with China that, of course, is about economics. It's also a political relationship, and the US has treaty allies in Asia. For the countries of Europe, the relationship with China has been overwhelmingly economic, and China is a market for European products. But with BRI, Europe started seeing China coming west and buying up strategic infrastructure across Europe. So I just thought the way you talked about that issue and thought about how to turn the tables on BRI was really interesting. Then when we had the team from the Ford School at the University of Michigan talking about debt relief for Africa, what really captured my imagination about that presentation was the US and the EU not just thinking about challenges we face within our own borders, but looking beyond our borders and saying, how can we be a force for good for the continent of Africa? And then taking a very specific issue like debt relief as a case in point. And it reminded me of the US attitude at the end of World War II, when the US proposed the Marshall Plan, proposed helping Europe recover economically from the war, encouraged European integration, encouraged the then European community. And it was an example of enlightened self-interest. And I felt that that was at the core of your presentation. And then the team from UC Berkeley, I thought your focus on technology was also very important, because if we think about 21st century challenges, it's this intertwining of China and its system of governance with technology, which will in so many ways shape the 21st century. So again, it was a third example of picking an issue that is so important as we think about what the US and the EU can do together in the world. So I thought these were terrific presentations. I learned a lot from all of you. And I just want to say, I'll echo Stavros in saying, I hope you stay engaged in foreign policy on transatlantic relations, because I'd like to see you all as the next generation that will shape what happens between the two sides of the Atlantic and what we can do together. So congratulations and thank you to all three teams and all 9 individuals. Over to Jim.
Thanks to both of you. Listen, folks, you give me hope, I'm sure to my colleagues as well, that there's smart, engaged people interested in these issues who will lead someday, right? I'm confident in listening to you tonight that many of you, all of you will lead, and we need that. Just particularly the emphasis on shared values, transatlantic, often lost, sadly, in the discussion, at least in this country, but in increasingly nationalist or populist politics, right? The shared values, which have served the peace well, right, for decades, but also then the value and importance of alliances and how alliances and working together can help you achieve those shared values. Again, something that's sadly often been lost in the political discussion, at least in this country. So let's hope that those shared values and that respect for, interest in alliances somehow wins the day. But good to see that those issues featured prominently in all your presentations, and well done to all 3 teams.
Brilliant. So, Paul, I think it's my time now to announce
the big moment.
The big moment. Well, coming up, it's like the Oscars a little bit. You have to wait because I would first like to make some honorary mentions for the top runners-up of each day, 3 days. So we would like to give a special praise to the following teams that almost made it to the final. From day 1, runners-up were the University of Rochester, Metropolitan State University of Denver, and Howard University. Day 2, runners-up, University of Wisconsin-Madison, American University School of International Service, and Wheaton College. And day 3, runners-up, Georgetown University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and California Polytechnic State University. You were fantastic. And let me just ask everyone, unfortunately, as you're sitting alone at home watching this, to give you all a huge round of applause. And now, I think, the moment has come to announce the winner of this year's Schuman Challenge. What we didn't see here today, but I know they're sitting somewhere biting their nails in anxiety, is your advisors and professors somewhere. So let me just thank them in addition to thanking you for having made such a brilliant show of foreign policy knowledge, expertise, and frankly, inventiveness and intelligence. I am really proud to be able to go through this, but I'm sure you don't care about that. What you do care is who actually won. So I'm going to do it in reverse order. Very, very close calls for all. In third place, UC Berkeley. In second place, is there a drum roll? Because I guess in the first place is also known automatically, but in second place, Ford School of Public Policy, University of Michigan. And that means, guys, that the winners of this year's Schuman Challenge are George Washington University. And I will walk, I think, towards the camera. Am I okay here? Oops, my mic. George Washington, warm congratulations. Absolutely fantastic performance and very richly deserved. And I look forward when the conditions allow to seeing you and frankly seeing all finalist schools at the residence at a wonderful lunch that I plan to organize for you. So congratulations. And now I think, what is the next? Karen? I think we're all Karen and Jim. Karen and Jim. Thank you.
So congratulations to all of you. This was really hard to decide among you. And I thought there were three qualities that all of the teams exhibited. And the reason in the end GW got that first place finish is because it was a smidge better on these three. And I would say one is expertise, just knowing the topic and sharing that knowledge with us. So connected to that is the ability to articulate that expertise in a way that's easy for others to follow. And then the third piece is working well as a team. And again, you all did that, but we felt GW did it just a smidge better. And I think those attributes, expertise that you have, your ability to communicate that expertise, and then your ability to work effectively as part of a team, those are skills that are going to serve you all so well going forward. And all 9 of you exhibited those attributes in spades this evening. So huge congratulations to all 3 teams. It was just such a pleasure to be part of this judging. Over to you, Jim.
Such a pleasure for me too. I have to say, guys and gals, this brought back a lot of memories. I was a debater in high school, a different kind of debate, but made a huge difference in my life. And there are skills, interests that I still draw on today, right? And had a real effect on what I do now, but I think opens a path for a whole host of careers, right? These skills, this knowledge base, this ability to articulate them, to crystallize your ideas, make a case, back that case up, that will serve you well wherever you go. And all of you are well on the way to that. And you should be aware of that. So nicely done. And like I said earlier, it gives me faith in the future of my country and the world. To echo Karen to some degree, I mean, what made the difference? I think specificity, the solution, the most specific solution and most achievable way to make a difference on a very key problem. I mean, all 3 of you identified key issues here. You all had smart plans for making a difference, and really it just came down to what qualitatively had a step above in terms of making a difference in addressing that problem in a very specific way. That's what made the difference. That said, I was impressed with all 3 presentations, and I really do wish you the best, and look forward to following your careers down the road.
That's brilliant. And let me just say on my part as well that one thing you should know is that already people in this embassy are writing a note back to Brussels, and we're including all 3 ideas and all 3 arguments to send to headquarters, just to show you how remarkably interesting and well done this was from all 3 of you. And who knows, maybe some of these issues will come in the conversation that the European Union Secretary of State, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, and the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, decided to launch, which is a EU-US dialogue on China. And many of these ideas that you threw out here, I can assure you are going to be in there as well. So thank you. And Paul, back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you on behalf of all the participating schools, thank you to all of our judges and the EU delegation for making this amazing experience possible for our students. Congratulations to our champions, our finalists, and the schools receiving honorable mention. Great work by all of our participating schools. This concludes the 2020 Schuman Challenge.